Most of us can't even imagine the anguish of the families who have loved ones on board that ill-fated flight. Psychologist Erik joins us now to talk about what they're going through and how they're beginning to grieve. Thanks so much for being with us. Let me just make this point, obviously. We all dream of saying goodbye to a loved one in a particular way, at old age, at the bedside, in very conventional terms. Long time to say goodbye, and then a clear beginning to the time to mourn. These people have been robbed of all of those things.
Yes.
What's the impact on them psychologically? Well,
we have to look at the combined factors of the emotions that they've been going through beforehand, the feelings of mistrust, the feelings of betrayal, the helplessness, the exhaustion they've been going through. All the stress of all these situations are adding to this, and there still is no closure. We as humans like to be able to have that contact with that person when they've passed, and even then, we still don't believe it sometimes.
That's, in fact, a crucial point here. The person, the remains. Every culture, every religion, every one of us reveres the remains of a loved one who dies, and they don't have human remains. How important is just that tangible, physical fact the person's absent?
It's the beginning. It's often the beginning of that process of the grieving that we can see that there is a finality. You know, not necessarily closure, but finality to that life, and we can potentially begin to move on. But a lot of them may not feel like they can move on because there are theories of conspiracy, because all the information hasn't been shared. There's a lot of feelings of being robbed and something stolen from you and taken from you, that people can get stuck in those feelings of betrayal and then anger, rage, and hatred, which are protective emotions that often help us to cover up our feelings of helplessness.
Now, you're not a clergyman, but there's a religious aspect to this, because for many people in many cultures, they feel like their loved one is going to another world, going to a better place. Every religion on the planet has rituals devoted to easing that journey, and this seems utterly anomalous. It's kind of a 21st century stain on every expectation every religion has.
Right. Well, and you have to look at, too, that in China, there's not necessarily state religion. So they don't necessarily have those religious rituals, but they do have funeral rituals based on Confucianism and other cultural rituals that have been set up. So they have those set up, and often historically, they grieved or had funerals for those who were older in the family, but not necessarily those who were younger. So if you follow those cultural rituals that were in the past, then some of those families may not have those rituals, even without the body. There's potentially no way to follow through on some of those rituals, which creates even more sense of grief and helplessness in the grieving process.
Now, you talked at the very outset about closure, which is something people they hope for. I don't know if anyone really gets it, but what kind of closure are these people ever going to get?
I don't think they won't have the closure they want. And again, it's one of those terms that's very nebulous. I think as we move through the grieving process, it's an extended process. We're reminded by the loss of people in other losses. There are people who are going through their post-traumatic loss from other plane events and plane losses through this event. So a lot of times our grief is connected to other people's losses and other situations that we see very visually in the news or we see in our communities, and therefore the grieving process is extended, sometimes over decades. It's not a simple process.
And yet, in this context, it's also anger. It's mixed with anger. It's mixed with some political issues as well.
Right. Well, and here you have I think that when we often have anger come up that's to this degree, sometimes it's misplaced from other situations in life. We have to look at that. Here's a situation with many of the Chinese are expressing their anger towards the Malaysian government and Malaysia Airlines. There's also a situation where there's in China, there's some potential distrust of the government. They felt the government wasn't really attending to their needs until more recently the government began to respond. And there's also some of the rumors that even some of the government may have been behind some of the protests that were staged to help guide them. So we have to look at, are there some more issues going here where they're trying to channel and focus that anger and rage towards Malaysia and towards the airlines, and they're trying to, whereas you have people who are feeling helpless and powerless, betrayed, misunderstood, and trying to gain some power in some ways.
Every element of this, it goes over and over in your head. Erik, psychologist, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.